Hello, my name is Angie Fife. I'm the Executive Director at ICLEI USA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Daring Cities 2021 plenary regarding the Climate Emergency Mobilization. According to the Climate Emergency Declaration and Mobilization in Action Initiative, as of June of this year, 2,000 local governments in 34 countries have declared a climate emergency. In addition, through the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience initiatives led by the UNFCCC high-level climate action champions, hundreds of cities, towns, and regions are now committing to climate neutrality and climate resilience towards 2050, including setting ambitious midterm targets to be met by 2030. Further commitments on circular economy, nature, and mobility are evolving through numerous partnerships. Experiences from the Dominican Republic, Rwanda, the US, as well as evolving efforts in South Korea and Japan, prove that practicing numerous models of multi-level collaboration can support more ambitious nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to achieve these long-term goals that we all hold dear in the Paris Agreement. In the most recent report, the IPCC states that humanity is reaching irreversible tipping points with devastating effects for all life on this planet. The increase of extreme climate events in many parts of the globe highlights the need to apply a mindset of permanent emergency to the ongoing situation. Cities and regions, local governments need to advance from the declaration and commitment to solution-oriented actions and implementation. And in doing so, they can inspire other jurisdictions to follow suit and to put themselves at the forefront of the global movement to act on the climate crisis. During day one of Daring Cities 2021, we therefore put an emphasis on the necessity to act and lead by example. As the 4th of October, today is World Habitat Day, the sessions are also designed as a means to contribute to the day's chosen theme, accelerating urban action for a carbon-free world, and its particular focus on the Race to Zero. In today's session, we will discuss exemplary cases of regional leaders who have not only declared a climate emergency, but are also rapidly advancing on their 2030 targets towards climate neutrality by 2050. With innovative practices on integrating nature-based solutions and building on their experiences dealing with the COVID-19 emergency, the need, importance, and benefits of building partnerships within communities will also be highlighted. It's my pleasure now to include you, the audience, in today's session. We have a poll for you. How would you rank the ambitiousness of your city or region's climate action? We'll give you a couple of moments to respond. Thank you for taking a moment to let us know where you rank. It is my pleasure now to introduce the first of our high-level speakers. I would like to welcome to the program from Brazil, Mayor State Secretary Geraldo Julio, who will contribute thoughts on the experience in driving ambitious climate action, both at the local and regional level, taking into account leadership in Recife to declare a climate emergency and then commit to climate neutrality, and the role the regional government can play in achieving these goals. State Secretary, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Muito obrigado, Angie. Prazer.
Thank you very much, Angie. It's a pleasure to participate in today's session on such an important date, such a symbolic date. We're talking about such an important subject as the one that we're discussing today. I would like to greet Yunus and everybody who's here with us today participating. I am here to talk about some actions that we've undertaken aligned with what we always call Yunus commitment and action for us to act and at the same time convince and lead by example. I'm always very inspired by one of your speeches. And I'd also like to say, Gino, that in South America and Latin America, we are focusing continually on convincing people, engaging people, and convincing people that this is fundamental, but engaging them through concrete actions as an example of what concretely represents actively searching for results to fight climate change. So I'm going to present to you some experiences from Recife that we did up until December last year, and now as a state secretary. I want to highlight one of the important actions that was the climate emergency declaration. Recife was the first city in Brazil to do that and to issue an official act acknowledging climate emergency in 2019, when we were the first city in the country to do that. Through a program and with the partnership with the Clay, and here I'm talking not as part of the Clay Council, but as a mayor back in 2013, when I first knew Clay, the opportunity to hear about successful experiences all over the world and bring them to Recife. So in 2014, we closed the first inventory for gas emissions. And since then, we've done 3 inventories in Recife, which is an important capital in Brazil. We set up a plan to reduce emissions immediately so that was measured during the second inventory. And now talking about mitigation and adaptation, which are also urgent subjects. We have to reduce emissions, but adaptation and mitigation are also equally important. And for that, we also established a partnership with the Clay. And Recife was able to undertake a study about the risk analysis and climate vulnerabilities and come up with an adaptation strategy. So we've been simultaneously working on the inventory using internationally recognized methodologies. Unlike some cities that, albeit with good intentions, they established a plan to reach goals without a scientifically established inventory. And we decided to first build this inventory based on science, and then only to move towards an action plan. And we've also undertaken some action plans. We did a green marathon in Recife that resulted in us planting 10,000 trees in only 1 week. That was a huge engagement with the media, the press, radio, TV, and digital networks to engage the residents of Recife around this initiative, where we planted 10,000 trees in only 1 week. One other important thing was the first Brazilian conference on climate change, which happened in Recife as well. It was also an important measure. And now, talking about the state level government, the state government has already closed the gas emission inventory in 2019. And in February, there'll be a plan for reducing emissions with the state government. Since after Recife, many other cities in the state of Pernambuco have also become associated to ICLEI and are seeking to implement concrete actions towards reducing emissions and mitigation and adaptation actions. These are very important initiatives that indicate that we're implementing actions and daring projects and actions. On the other hand, engagement is also fundamental. And Recife, for instance, was able to lead the largest committee from South America for COP25 in Madrid. We also brought a large committee so participating in an international discussion with large international engagements, participating in the discussions and conferences, and during the pandemic, participating in all of the events, even though they occurred virtually, but participating in an international discussion is important, as well as convincing the local administration. And I'd like to highlight that for a primary school, we included the discipline of fighting climate change. So children studying at public schools, just like they study other disciplines such as mathematics, biology, and other languages, they will also study the fight against climate change. And that creates local engagement and creates knowledge among children. So these are some of the examples that I wanted to show you very briefly, but I could not shy away from participating in this event. Thank you for changing the calendar of the event and the script. I'd like to thank the participants from all of the different countries that are here with us today. I would like to thank Angie for coordinating our activities. And at the same time, Gino, I would like to apologize, and I have to say goodbye to you because I have some medical problems in the family, and I have to prioritize that. But I did not want to fail to be here. But a few minutes before my presentation, the physician called me, and I will have to unfortunately leave the meeting. Thank you, Gino, for yet this opportunity. ICLEI Latin America, ICLEI South America. Thank you for the opportunity. Hopefully I've been able to contribute to the discussion. And next time, hopefully I'll be able to participate in the entire session. Thank you all very much for being with us. And I'll give the floor back to Angie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, State Secretary Julio, and best to you and your family. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today. We very much appreciate it. Wishing you well. All right. And now we turn to the Scottish government. We are happy to welcome the Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity with the Scottish government, Minister Slater. Minister Slater will contribute thoughts on the progress of the Scottish government in reaching the climate neutrality targets, including the role of the Climate Emergency Declaration adopted by the Scottish Parliament. You're also welcome to share the experience of the Scottish government in the development of the Edinburgh biodiversity process. Over to you, Minister Slater. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind me taking a sort of more personal approach to this to introduce you to who I am and where we are in Scotland with our approach to the climate crisis. So I'm actually the leader of the co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, and we have recently completed a cooperation agreement with the Scottish government, which is dominated by the Scottish National Party. So we have worked together, we'll now be working together in partnership to deliver on Scotland's very ambitious climate targets. So this is something new for the UK. I know in other parts of the world we have green parties in government, but this is something entirely new to the UK, and we're doing this for the first time in Scotland. And for myself, I have been a minister for 4 weeks now. I was elected in May, and previously I was an electromechanical engineer and I worked in renewable energy. So this is all new to me. So I'm very much learning how to be a minister, how government works. And from my title, you can see that my portfolio area is green skills, circular economy, and biodiversity. And from this, you can see that the Scottish government is recognizing the kind of twin pillars of the climate crisis, which is the sort of climate crisis in the sense of the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere and the global heating that results from that, but also the biodiversity crisis, and that these things are absolutely interlinked. So we now have me as the Minister for Biodiversity in Scotland working, that'll be my responsibility to work on improving our biodiversity and healing our natural environment in Scotland. And Ms. Fife introduced, when she just talked about the circular economy, of course, that's a very big part of our approach here, and I'm sure will be everywhere, to move away from what we've been terming the linear economy, where we make stuff, it breaks or falls apart, and then we throw it away, or we use it and throw it away, but instead making sure that everything we use gets put back into the economy and nothing is, or very little is wasted. Scotland has some of the world's most ambitious climate targets to be carbon neutral by 2045. And by bringing in the Scottish Greens, I think that into government, so now we're all part of government, to help us deliver on that, because we are the party that have the expertise and some of the more radical visions for what we're going to need, because really we're going to need radical visions. Those of you who speak English as native speakers will be able to tell that I don't have a Scottish accent, that I am actually Canadian, and the Scottish accent is a very clearly identifiable accent for English speakers, and I do not have one. So I was born and raised in Canada, and in Canada, when it comes to biodiversity, we're in a very different place than the UK is, than Scotland is, and that's because Canada still has some pieces of Canada that are wilderness, that are untouched by human management or relatively untouched. Scotland is different though. Scotland has been managed by humans for thousands of years. And so the landscape here and the seascape, our seabeds and our marine environment are entirely different. There is nothing here that hasn't been managed. And that makes our biodiversity crisis very, very acute. Our landscape is very, very degraded. Our seabeds are very degraded from this continual human usage. But what that means is that there is a lot of scope in Scotland to restore our land and to regenerate it. And that, I feel, is a big part of what we can bring here, that when we're tackling the crisis, there's the sort of energy side of it. We have to stop using fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And at the same time, we have to pull out of the atmosphere quite a lot of the carbon that's already in there. So one of the problems I have with the terminology of net zero is that it has been hijacked to some extent by the oil and gas industry, who are trying to tell a story that they can keep emitting because, don't worry, we'll pull that back out of the atmosphere later. We'll develop some carbon capture technologies and it'll be fine. Don't worry, we can still keep emitting. And we can't. That isn't true. What's true is that we have to stop using fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And at the same time, we have to pull out of the atmosphere a lot of carbon that's already there. There's already enough carbon in the atmosphere to drive global heating to 3.5 degrees Celsius. Now that in my country means that the city of Glasgow, our biggest city, would be half underwater. That's a major catastrophe, and that would affect all of us worldwide in terms of our access to food, our access to clean water. Our coastal cities everywhere will be underwater. So it isn't enough to say net zero. I think we need to be really clear about, we do have to achieve net zero, but it must be achieved through emissions reductions, and to be very accurate with our language. And when we mean emissions reductions, to say emissions reductions. So a big part of our approach in Scotland is what we call a just transition. The Scottish industry and our industrial base has historically had a significant input from North Sea oil and gas industry. We also in Scotland still bear the economic scars of the last energy transition, when we transitioned as our economy from coal over to the current oil and gas. When the coal mines were closed down in the 1970s and the 1980s, that led to terrible economic devastation in many of our communities, generational poverty, communities decimated, young people leaving. And what we want to make sure is that during this new energy transition away from oil and gas to new, clean, renewable sources of energy, that we don't cause that economic devastation, that we have a just transition, that we make sure that communities benefit, that we make sure that there is government intervention to ensure that people can transfer their skills from oil and gas. Many of those same skills, technical skills, leadership skills, are transferable to renewable industries, but also to these very important industries on land restoration and nature regeneration, both on land and in the sea. There's huge potential there. So we really believe that social justice and environmental justice go hand in hand. You really can't have one without the other. How can you expect people to be concerned about cities flooding 100 years in the future if their children don't have enough to eat today, if they can't get the cancer treatment they need today? So it's absolutely imperative that social justice and environmental justice go together. And so a big part of tackling the climate crisis in Scotland is our Fair Work agenda. A lot of that involves what we call community wealth building, to make sure that people can use the resources in their area to decide how they want their community to function. So as we go forward, will their communities benefit from renewable energy, from new types of farming, from new types of forestry? How do communities themselves want to use their landscapes and the resources around them? And how do they want to benefit from them? So if they're going to allow a new wind farm, how much of the supply chain, how much of the profits from that enterprise come back into the local community? So I think there's a big piece around tackling this from both directions and making sure that communities are well involved. Now, my hope for COP26 is that we can have a global communication about the scale of what we need to do to change. Because some of what worries me about the conversation that I hear maybe from the UK government is that there's a feeling that, you know, a few bamboo toothbrushes and electric cars and we're sorted, you know, and if that isn't the case, the scale of how our land use has to change, the scale of our economic model from that linear model to a circular one has to change. And I don't think many governments have really grasped what that means, but I'm obviously very hopeful that we have in Scotland and have started making some new steps in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minister, for that intervention. So interesting to hear how you position biodiversity in a circular way. Really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. And I know we'll have lots of questions for you. But first, we have one more intervention. I'd like to welcome to the program now Mayor Emilio Hatton from the city of Santa Fe in Argentina. The mayor will contribute thoughts on how states and regions can take leadership towards reaching net zero targets, and doing so will highlight some of the successes in the city of Santa Fe. Welcome to the program, Mayor.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you from Latin America. Hello, Gino, Angie, everyone who is here connected, who has invited us to this global meeting. And hello to everyone participating in this panel. I was listening to the other speakers. It is very interesting to see the lessons learned, where in my city, Santa Fe, as the leader here, it is very important to be part of these networks, such as ICLEI, and create other committees. In South America, it's nice to be one of the representatives. And truly, it is very important to be here in this global forum with such interesting characteristics, talking about these programs. I think this brings to attention one of the main themes, that is the global climate crisis. And we have to think about our own practices, because the world has a limited time to act. We have limited time to act. If we're willing to stop climate crisis, we need to act now, as was said before. We cannot do this alone. I mean, small cities like my city, for instance, it is useless to think that only my city, with under 500,000 people, we cannot think that this is going to be enough. We have to actually work as a network and also inspire other places to be part of this. This is key to understand the current problems that societies are facing right now. Well, we are convinced that green recovery, that fair recovery is a main goal, and this is the pathway that we have chosen for the 2030 agenda. So, of course, we are also aware that we shouldn't just put our personal ambitions here in this game. We have to think about more broad strategies. I think that COP26 is actually going to help us to leave those smaller ambitions beside and try and implement broad strategies. In Santa Fe, the city, we are working with this great commitment with the climate change initiatives. So we try to have concrete actions. We are inspired by other networks and cities, and we're trying to also make sure that that everyone is engaged here, community level. I think the community has to be a part of this, because otherwise we're not really going to be able to change much. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic brought many lessons. One of them is actually taking part in these actions as a group. In Santa Fe, we're trying to potentiate all this from small ideas. Sometimes in these forums, we listen to small ideas and they might seem very simple in the beginning, but actually those very small steps are going to be the very foundation of something bigger, something that is going to be large enough to help us with the climate change initiatives. So as human beings and as leaders in each and every region, we have to focus on that as well. For instance, we have been working as a network to work with bike lanes. We have been trying to implement some alternative methods of transportation. And of course, we haven't reached a broad agreement to have an inventory to understand what we have and what we do not have, but we are on the path to do that, to create many different points of view around that. We're trying to potentiate the idea of having 15 minutes commute in the city. It is the city of the 15 minutes, as we call it. We have a program to integrate such services. So we're recovering some public spaces, streets, roads, improving urban hygiene, and improving the conditions, especially in the more vulnerable parts of the city. So I wanted to remind you that we have 70% of the territory here is water and 30% is land. And that has brought us many problems with water. I mean, it's great to have water. We are here living with the water, but we also have some issues in that regard. So today, for instance, in this city, 70 years ago, for 70 years, we hadn't had an issue with the Paraná River as we do nowadays. We're having issues with drinking water right now, but we're still working solidly with climate change and looking at 2030. Santa Fe is part of this 2030 agenda, and we have created a special zone in downtown Santa Fe so that people are not going to drive more than 30 kilometers an hour in this small zone. It might seem like a very simple and small step, but it is much better now to have bike lanes, to have people using other types of transportation in a safe manner. So we've done this, integrating every player in this area, and we have a pact for mobility, as we call it. So all of the players together have been trying to assemble a good mobility plan so that in the future, we're going to commute in a much better way. So everyone in Santa Fe and everyone coming to Santa Fe are going to have a much better plan for that, for good mobility. So for carbon neutral, we've been working with ICLEI to try and reduce the greenhouse effect emissions and all the emissions. So we reaffirm our commitment as a city to make this social impact visible from a good plan, from good urban logistics standpoint that is efficient. In Santa Fe, I would say that the main enemy, and probably for you too, but for us, we see that people are just using and putting everything in the trash and wasting, and that's a lot of waste. We have to work in circular economy. We've been trying to do that because circular economy is going to help us fight the lack of occupancy as well. We see some statistics in Santa Fe showing that 50% of the people are under the poverty line. So circular economy, I am sure, is going to help us a lot. It is actually already helping us. We've been collecting electronics and some other products to recycle them in different parts of the city. So we have some cooperative networks where that is recycled and that can be used again. That goes back to people, to vulnerable parts of the city. So we are convinced that this is going to bring a lot of benefits, not just economic benefits, it's not just about the economics, it's also about the environmental issues that we are facing. So we have stations in the city, centers or hubs where we get all the residues, for instance, wooden residues and all that, and that is going to become firewood in many cases and energy source in many other cases. So we're trying to really look at the carbon footprint in that manner. So we're building some other stations, some other centers, so that everyone can do composting at their homes, at these centers. And we do also training for people, different trainings, workshops for people to learn different things, different trades. It might seem, for many of you, it might seem like a very simple thing. Maybe you're thinking about different or broader strategies, or maybe you have done this already, but we're trying to start simple, start small. Santa Fe has to start somehow. It is important to adhere to the policies that are in place so that we start reducing emissions, and time is ticking. So we're trying to work. I know we still have a long way ahead of us, but it's clear that we have a roadmap now, and that's going to allow us to have a greener, more human, more sustainable future, especially as a network with all of you all together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Thank you for your leadership, for your words here today. And Minister Slater, we thank you as well. I know there are a number of Green Party folks in the United States who could learn from some of your good examples. So maybe we'll be in more close contact. I want to thank both of our speakers and now move to a short presentation and a fireside chat that I am very pleased to be a part of. I'd like to introduce first Dr. Philip Rode, who's the Executive Director at LSC Cities and Associate Professorial Research Fellow for the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Philip, to the program.
Thank you very much, Angie. And it's a real privilege and honor to be surrounded by so many doers and following up now with a bit of maybe conceptual perspectives, hopefully is also appropriate and will advance the discussion. So I'll kick this off, as we've just heard, with a few slides and essentially bring this question of a climate emergency to the broader issue of governing complex emergency and what the implications are for cities and regions. This relies on work which we are currently doing with UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, and Metropolis under the so-called Emergency Governance Initiative for Cities and Regions. Now, I think we are all acutely aware that we actually have produced quite astonishing, very positive global frameworks. The global agendas 5-6 years ago, whether it's the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, or the New Urban Agenda specifically related to cities, are very important guiding North Stars. There's just one problem as we are coming closer to some of the key deadlines. We are moving far too slow, and everyone realizes it. The speakers have already alluded to that. A lot of our government institutions and civil society institutions are too weak to balance vested interests. And overall, there's great disconnection to have full legitimacy for the radical change that is required. The patience is running thin, and we're seeing this that not only in relation to climate, but people are increasingly bringing urban issues to the street around housing, social justice, and demanding urgent action. And they often, not only in the climate space, are increasingly using this term emergency. So you will, of course, be all aware of the big protests in all our streets by younger generations in particular. And then there's COVID, where the emergency was very formally declared by the World Health Organization, and where many national and city governments also pulled their sort of formal legislation around emergencies. Now, what we are seeing here, and this is quite unique, we are seeing that grand challenges, take as a proxy the SDGs, are essentially being reframed as complex emergencies, bringing in this time pressure on top of course, a massive challenge. And I want to give you here a bit of a sort of conceptual differentiation between what are very strong existing not just emergencies, which we know about, but also where we have very good institutional frameworks, particularly at the city and regional level, responding to those emergencies. So routine emergencies, non-routine emergencies. And then there's this new set of things, global emergencies like climate, but also global health emergencies, and a whole range of social emergencies. And they share a few characteristics which we really need to appreciate before we go into the solution space and before we start also realigning our institutions with the actual needs on the ground. Complex emergencies are long emergencies. They're beyond political memory and also social memory in many of our societies. Very uncertain. There are trade-offs between lives and livelihoods. We have seen this constantly as a debate around COVID, although sometimes very artificially inflated. There are political challenges. There's also a delayed disaster, which we're trying to, of course, avoid. And it's therefore not in our face. It's not obvious to the electorate that we are in the midst of a massive emergency. There's no real trigger moment, like saying exactly at this time, now we need to do something. And there's an emergency response paradox, which says when we get it right, a lot of our residents will actually not encounter the disaster and then may question why all this radical fast change altogether. So many different characteristics which are quite special and which we need to know more about. Now, this was said before. The emergency declarations are a reality, not just by the demands through the street, but the formal declarations. Now more than 1 billion citizens reside in the more than 2,000 local governments and jurisdictions that have formally declared a climate emergency. Yet at the same time, there's very little experience and knowledge and exchange about how we govern these emergencies, besides sort of the formal declaration. That's just the beginning of something much bigger. And while resilience frameworks and a whole range of really good thinking about emergency response is very much covering the whole spectrum from protection all the way to recovery, we now have to have a conversation what we need to do during the actual emergency response. And on that, it's clear that a lot of technocratic structures need to be reformed and processes need to be reinvented and put forward. What you're seeing here is the Rio de Janeiro Command and Control Center to deal with local emergencies, mainly flooding. That's how it was set up, but a whole range of other things. But far more importantly, we really need to understand what is the implication for democracy more generally, but also for local democracy. And climate assemblies, as the one here depicted by the London Borough of Camden, are of course a very interesting tool, which a lot of us have now invested energy and time understanding better and contributing to. Now, as part of the Emergency Governance Initiative, we have come up with sort of 10 emerging principles for governing complex emergencies. Climate, of course, being maybe the biggest of all. I won't read all of these out in detail. You'll find a lot of our information online, but I do want to stress just a few. Government needs to be in the driving seat. This is not to make a new case for statism. It's just to realize that the only legitimate organization that can really lead the change, that then of course needs to be contributed to by the private, by the third and civil society actors, but the leadership is with government. And we must really recognize this. And yet at the same time, there are, of course, very legitimate, important concerns about human rights and social justice. And the two of them we need to take care of. Fourth point here about a new governance by empathy, by our political leaders, which may involve new forms of collaboration and co-creation and experimentation is important. And then, of course, always needs to be re-emphasized at the very bottom here, no one size fits all. Yes, we can all come together, global learning, hearing and learning about processes on different continents. Ultimately, we then need to ground this in very specific local contexts. And that's what cities and local governments are so good at. So I'm now looking forward to a conversation with Angie, and hopefully we get some tough questions as well.
You can count on that, Dr. Rohde. Thank you so much for teeing up the conversation. And I really enjoyed reading an article that you published about 2 years ago now on this topic. And I was struck by the fact that smaller cities were actually the first cities to declare climate emergency, but of course, mega cities have done this now as well. And you mentioned one size does not fit all. What are the different approaches for different sizes of governments, and how are they different and how are they the same?
I think the first thing to say that the declaration of a climate emergency and the actions that come with that is a concept for all political entities and levels. It doesn't sort of prefer one over the other. It is interesting that medium-sized, smaller-sized cities were really creating the energy. Maybe cities that had even sort of a stronger tradition of really working with local communities, and where sort of the noise of those communities isn't balanced out by very powerful interests in, you know, whether it's a mega city or city of several million. But I do think what now needs to happen is, on the basis of realizing where the real power lies in these very specific local contexts, understand how the emergency can be interpreted beyond just terminology and a catchphrase. How can it be operationalized in the day-to-day running of government? And I think back to one of the slides I used, the single most important thing is we need to create new political arenas to engage with our populations in such a way that this whole thing doesn't backfire. Because what we ultimately mean by emergency is a very harsh prioritization of climate action, or whatever emergency we're declaring, over all other priorities, and there are many others. And what we're also saying is that this needs to be done in a just way, so that we are not really running those actions on the backs of those that are already disadvantaged.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly. And you mentioned this, you know, sustaining the emergency. I think about resilience and how we sometimes characterize that as, you know, the ability to withstand both shocks and stresses. So both the immediate wildfire and the long-term drought, you know, except that the climate emergency seems like this sustained shock. What do you advise city leaders to do to maintain that sort of sense of urgency without, you know, leaving all of us feeling fatigued and unable to engage?
Yeah, that's important. And I think it's a very fundamental sort of also conceptual contradiction in the term of emergency, because the whole idea is that for a few days, maybe a few weeks or months maximum, you can absolutely concentrate on dealing with you know, the house on fire or whatever it may be, to then go back into normal mode governance. I think what I therefore prefer as an interpretation of the climate emergency is the one of this deep prioritization. That yes, there are a range of issues we need to deal with, but we need to quite rigorously organize them in a hierarchy of what is the most urgent. And you know, it's so hard to argue against putting climate at the top of the pile, and then ensure that whatever is being done in the policy context, where we put our money, what we're investing, what kind of projects we're advancing, that the first and simplest test is, does this support the trajectory towards a safe climate or not? And if the answer is not, we don't go close to that policy. And I think that's an interpretation of an emergency which allows for more sustained focus on and analysis for what's the right policy, what's the right collective way forward, as opposed to the complete sort of shock and just radical action for the sake of just overcoming the next hours or days, as we may have it with, you know, extreme freak weather conditions for a few days or weeks. This is sort of a different psychological state. And we need to be prepared for sustaining the climate emergency for probably several decades. So that is quite central to appreciate.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that cities both need to prioritize this, but also institutionalize it so that it's part of their day-to-day governing. At ICLEI USA, we developed a fairly in-depth case study a couple of years ago regarding New York City's decision to divest its pension fund from fossil fuels investments. And some cities in the United States, such as Fort Collins, have aligned their municipal budgeting process with climate action. How do you think we should think about investments and the climate emergency?
So this is where local context really matters, and to some degree also political tactics. to really understand where are the things which doesn't immediately alienate my local constituency, where there is maybe already a broad base of agreement. The spectrum is here quite wide, yes, and it could be addressing issues of where the city invests its pensions. It can be the transport transition and a quite sort of radical rethink of how we are operating our local streets. Or it may be indeed a city that controls, and there are a few, unfortunately not enough, that control their power generation, send out the multi-utility companies to really commit and deliver with the money they make selling energy on to their citizens, to have the transition not by 2030, but as some cities actually aiming for, already by 2025, to be entirely carbon neutral when it comes to city level electricity. So really important that we appreciate that this needs to be tailored to context. And then at the same time, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, there are a couple of issues which we must not ignore. And above all, I don't think we can celebrate sort of beautiful, wonderful carbon neutrality when we have a massive consumption budget in our city. What I mean by that is that our, whatever city, particularly wealthier cities, are consuming items where the emissions are produced elsewhere, where maybe also the local tourist economy and retail economy is based on global supply chains. This is not something which we can afford turning sort of a blind eye to. Eventually, this will bite us. So the sooner we also get to those much tougher conversations, the better.
Great, thank you. I'd like to invite our audience to comment on Daring Cities 2021 call for transformation. And let us hear your questions and thoughts as well. And as we wrap up, I'd like to ask one more question of Dr. Rohde, and then also allow the minister and the mayor to come in and also comment on this particular question. And it has to do with ways to engage and communicate with youth. How do you recommend leaders best engage in terms of their communication and actions to get youth involved in this very important issue? To Dr. Rohde first.
Yes, so I do think we're at a point where we need to channel the energy that has been developed in the street, in the schools, amongst younger activists, and bring them into the sort of political mainstream. Partially that's already happening, and we're seeing unbelievably talented young often women to take on the establishment. Even the Green Party establishment is sometimes exposed to very tough questioning by the younger generation. The more we can open doors where this energy can be then funneled beyond protest towards proposition and engagement, the better. I think we need to have in our city halls, whether it's in the council chamber or also in the city administration, those voices that are maybe, pushing extreme measures which up until recently were almost not accepted in the political discourse. To have that at the formal table makes all the difference. And of course, having people around the formal table of negotiation connected with an activist on the ground is always a very good thing for democratic practices. So give them not just a voice, but an opportunity to be part of the more formal political processes would be an important first step. And for sure, we should immediately start allowing young adults from the age of 16 to at least vote at the city and regional level. I think that would be a major priority.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Mayor Haran. Any thoughts, comments, interventions you'd like to provide, maybe in 60 seconds, 1 minute, on the youth topic, please?
Sure, of course. Well, it's very interesting to listen to other people's experiences. It's interesting to see that everyone is facing pretty much the same issues. It's a little bit different in smaller places. It is true. I was listening to Philip Rowe talking about how to interpret these issues from a smaller place perspective. I mean, this is what we are trying to do and manage here. It is important to have a list of priorities. We have been thinking about that. And we have different lists of priorities all the time, but the main thing is within those priorities, we also have to demand, we also have to make sure that we have education about the environment as well. Like earlier today, I was talking about the fact that people just use things once and put it in the trash. And that's one of the main issues. I think that's the very beginning, the very cause, the root of everything. We understand that there should be a hierarchy. We understand there are things that are more urgent. And as Philip was saying, we have to institutionalize all this, the management of the environment. It is very difficult when we have generations that are older than 30 in Latin America and believe that the environment is just a matter, a thing that is never going to end. But nowadays, we need to make sure that people understand the dimension of this issue. I think that probably in Europe that has been already, discussed, but here it's not the case. Now in Santa Fe, we are surrounded by water, as I said before, but people don't understand what we're bringing the drinking water with pumps from very, very profound rivers. So we're using liters and liters of water for everyone here in Santa Fe, and people don't really understand the meaning of that. So we have to make sure that education about the environment, about these issues, is really for everyone here. So we have to make sure that we change their attitude, that they understand the dimension of this issue. If we're able to do that, if they understand, if they interpret the issue, it's going to be much easier.
Thank you, Mayor. And Minister Slater, you come to this with a fresh set of eyes. So I wanted to give you the last word here, being new in your role and new to government. Yeah, what are your thoughts about the climate emergency and youth?
Well, my thoughts are that it's not the youth that are the problem. The youth didn't cause the climate emergency, and neither did poor people. The youth largely get it. So here in Scotland, and I think around the world, young people have been a driver of bringing the climate emergency activism. They have made it mainstream. The problem is not engaging with the young people. The problem is engaging with older, richer, largely white men who constitute the vested interests here and have the power. They're the problem, because a big thing that we have to talk about is when we talk about transforming our economy and transforming our way of life, we have to tackle the rich. It's the rich people who are causing the problem, the people who take many flights a year, people who drive SUVs, people who consume far more than they need. And we have this weird situation around the world where we have governments, and I include myself in this, made up of people who have more than they need, trying to decide who's allowed to have enough. What if everybody had enough and we sat around talking about who's allowed to have a bit more? The whole system has to change. So it isn't the young people that are the problem. The young people get it. And young people I talk to already talk about wanting to live a meaningful life, about wanting to spend time with friends and family, about valuing experience over ownership. The young people get it, that life is not about buying as much crap as you can fit in your house, that there is more to life. And that is the narrative we need to change. But it is definitely the older generations and the vested interest that we have to communicate that to. Tackling the climate crisis doesn't involve sacrifice. It involves valuing those things that are really important: our families, our friends, our environment, our cities, and making sure that they have a long and healthy future.
Well done, well said. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today, to Dr. Rode. Thank you for your contributions to this topic. And we will close now with a video.
Honorable mayors, governors, deputies, councillors, experts and practitioners, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start, of course, by thanking ICLEI team, not only for this event, but for the amazing and fundamental work they're doing in the fight towards climate change. We all know the science is absolutely clear. Time is running out and the risks associated with climate change are absolutely existential. To have a chance of a stable planet for future generations, we must cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 and then continue to have them every decade for a decarbonized global economy by mid-century. We have less than 30 years. This is even more evident from the Code Red, the latest report released by the IPCC a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, science is also telling us that we are not yet on the right track. And indeed, we will have to change course in an accelerated manner to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. On the other hand, the good news is that the transition to sustainability is definitely accelerating. We see a growing number of net zero commitment by many non-state and subnational actors responsible for all sectors of the economy, all scales of governance, all regions of the world. And the Race to Zero campaign has now become the golden standard of what it means to make a credible commitment. Race to Zero, or the Race to Zero, is a global campaign supported by the United Nations, bringing together the leadership and support of businesses, cities, regions, and investors for a healthy, resilient, carbon-free recovery, one that prevents future threats, creates decent jobs, and fosters sustainable growth. All members are all committed to the same overarching goal, halving emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050 at the very latest, across the board, quickly and fairly, in line with the Paris Agreement and with the transparent actions and action plans and robust near-term targets. Its sister campaign, Race to Resilience, is catalyzing a radical shift in global climate resilience ambition, putting people and nature first in the quest for a resilient world where we not only survive climate shocks and stresses, but thrive in spite of them. With these two sibling campaigns, we aim to drive change ahead of COP26. This will send a strong signal to governments that businesses, cities, regions, and investors are all united to meet the Paris goals and create a more inclusive and resilient decarbonized economy. So to join the campaigns, all entities must meet minimum criteria behind what we call the 4 Ps: pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. C40, the Global Governance of Mayors for Climate and Energy, ICLEI, and the Under2 Coalition serve as the partners in Cities Race to Zero for states, regions, and cities to join the campaign. Race to Zero is now including more than 6,200 members from 110 countries, including nearly 4,500 companies, 800 cities, 35 regions, 731 educational institutions, 45 health institutions representing more than 3,000 hospitals, 250 financial institutions already representing more than $90 trillion in net zero commitments. Only in the last year alone, Race to Zero has experienced dramatic growth, 190% across all stakeholder types, despite the pandemic. Regions have increased by 60%, including now 6 from Latin America. Cities have increased by 77%, also with the pride of knowing that we brought many of them from Latin America. So subnational governments currently in the Race to Zero represent 11% of the world's population. In the last 3 months alone, cities and regions representing nearly 100 million people have joined the campaign. And their baseline emissions cover at least 10% of global CO2 emissions. The combined carbon footprint of these subnational governments is larger than that of India. But although the numbers look really good, encouraging, it's a sign of hope, they are certainly not enough. So I not only invite you, I urge you to commit by joining the race, a race that is just starting. We call Glasgow, the COP26, as the entry point to the race. This is a race where in the end, if done properly and with the correct ambition, we all win. Thank you very much.
And thank you to the Chilean high-level champion, Mr. Gonzalo Munoz, for your closing words. Thank you all for attending. This is just the beginning of Daring Cities. Please check out more sessions later in the week. Thank you all for being part of this and have a wonderful day. Thank you all.